Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Megan Jacobs and I'm an associate professor here in the Honors College. And today is part of a series of public lectures for the Honors College Discovery Series. And these lectures are meant to highlight scholars' unique research and methodologies. And I'm going to introduce our guest speaker here in just a second. I'd like to begin by reading the UNM Indigenous Peoples Land and Territory Acknowledgement. Founded in 1889, the University of New Mexico sits on the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia. The original peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache, since time immemorial, have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community. Statewide, we honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of the land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous peoples. We gratefully recognize our history. Today, I'm really pleased to introduce our speaker, Aida Revilla. Aida is an undergraduate student at UNM who is double majoring in psychology and honors interdisciplinary liberal arts. While at UNM, she has been a Mellon Mays undergraduate research fellow, an officer, and I'm sorry if I butcher this name, Kaisal Kitchkli, and the president of the Hobbit Society. She's planning to get a PhD in psychology or sociology and pursue a career as a professor. Today, Aida will chronicle the pedagogical approach to co-teaching UHAN 301, Chicanx Civil Rights, in the presentation Making Space, the Importance of Including Chicanx Studies in College. Please join me in welcoming Aida.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming. Again, my name is Aida Revilla, and I will start my presentation now. And I'm just going to read my paper because I'm actually very nervous.
Don't forget to share your screen too.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. There we go. I was born and raised in Cicero, Illinois, a community that the U.S. Census Bureau estimates its population to be 89.7% Hispanic or Latino, according to data from 2019. I grew up surrounded by first and second generation immigrants who spoke primarily Spanish at home. We heard broken English regularly and served as translators for our families from very young. Everyone I knew growing up had similar backgrounds. My first generation status did not make me unique. So I was not conscious that my experience growing up was special. I did not learn how to connect with people of different backgrounds because all I had ever known were people like me. Even less did I learn to recognize that people like me, Mexican Americans, can have their own unique experiences in communities across the US. Growing up in Cicero, I learned many lessons that I did not understand the true value of until I reached college. While the approximately 4 years of college are formative years for everyone, those who do not have a strong sense of self and a network of support often see themselves struggling more than necessary. I came to realize this and understand it when taking Chicano studies courses. The lessons I have learned by virtue of my identity as Mexican American and the theories that have validated them while taking Chicano studies are what give me the confidence to teach a course to a group of my peers. As a psychology major, I would not have had the opportunity to take Chicano studies courses, and much less the opportunity to teach this course. Honors was the only place for me to discuss issues that are particularly important to my community. But it was also the place that made me feel the most far removed from my Chicana identity. The spaces we are allowed to take up are crucial to Chicanx academic success. And if the Honors College is truly dedicated to providing an intensive interdisciplinary and cross-cultural liberal education to highly motivated, talented, and creative undergraduates in all majors, then they need to allow Chicanx, Black, and Indigenous people of color to take up space. Majoring in honors and teaching Chicana civil rights and social movements is my way of taking up space and demanding that you allow my future generations to do so as well. One of the most important lessons I learned from Cicero is the value of community. In Illinois, we get several feet of snow every winter. My mom had a diesel buggy. Some mornings our buggy would not start or it was covered in snow. So every time we had several feet of snow fall overnight or the weather was below freezing, my mother and I would wake up extra early in order to prepare to walk to school. More often than not, our neighbor was waiting at her window, dressed and ready to give us a ride. We never asked her to. She noticed us walking one day, and from then on, she would offer to drive us whenever the weather was bad. When I started high school, we had moved from my childhood home to an apartment. My school was only 2 blocks away, so walking even after a snowstorm was no problem. That never struck me as odd until one morning while it was snowing, I saw a neighbor shoveling the sidewalk. At 7 in the morning, while it was still snowing, my neighbor was shoveling their sidewalk so that I and all the other kids making their way to school could walk safely. While I walked to school that morning and I watched my neighbor shovel the snow out of my way, I was filled with an overwhelming sense of gratitude. I could not put it into words at the moment, so all I could say was good morning. That moment made me realize that every one of my neighbors got up before going to work to shovel the snow out of my way. It made me reflect on other events throughout my life. At every moment, there was someone, a complete stranger, that offered me help when I most needed it. My community taught me many things, but this was the most important: to always extend my hand to help someone up. Moving to Albuquerque and starting college was an earth-shattering experience. Having grown up in Cicero also taught me to be very proud of my heritage and my identity as a Mexican American. In fact, I still have trouble using any other term than Mexican to refer to myself. But I have learned to accept my identity as Mexican American as a way of acknowledging the privilege that I have. Speaking my language, speaking of my identity and my people's history comes as naturally to me as breathing. In my community, I always felt safe and appreciated. I felt at home. Previously, I could change back and forth between languages and make jokes in Spanish, and I was still understood. In New Mexico, I found myself having to explain or translate my jokes. It ruined them. In college was where I first experienced direct racism and discrimination. The most confusing part of it was that it came from people that are the most like me, myself, Novo Mexicanos. The New Mexican desert became a very hostile environment, where I would be asked, "What language are you speaking? Where are you from?" when I talked to my mother in Spanish at the store. When I replied, "Spanish and Chicago," I was met with a very confused face, and I didn't know they speak Spanish in Chicago. This may not seem like a big deal, but these are the types of microaggressions we keep talking about. Assuming I am not from here, whether that be New Mexico, Chicago, or the United States at large, simply by the language I speak, ignores the hundreds of US inhabitants that do not speak English. It is also a question I would never get if I was speaking English. When I was failed in my psychology research methods course by a Novo Mexicano, despite having scored high on all of my exams and assignments, I reached out to the professor telling him there was no way I failed his class. My only reply was that he had changed my grade. He knew my name and my face because I was the first to turn in our first exam, and he said to me, "You finished taking it even before me," as he read my name on the paper. When I have been ignored or treated unfairly when I did everything right, the only cause I could find was my intersectional identity as a woman of color. This understanding came from learning about New Mexico colonial history in my Chicano studies courses. Novo Mexicanos have a completely unique history that has shaped their identity. They are also very proud of their heritage, but many are split on what that history actually is. Novo Mexicano identity has been split into those who have believed they are of Spanish heritage and those who know they are mestizos. From this illusory Spanish heritage, many conflicts have arisen. In New Mexico, Hispanic takes on many meanings and is rejected by some entirely. Being Hispanic in New Mexico can mean Mexican, New Mexican, mestizo, or Spanish. I had never met a Hispanic who identifies as Spanish until I moved here. Everyone I knew who identified as Hispanic was of Mexican descent, and everyone I knew of Spanish origin identified as Spanish. When I first heard someone say they were Spanish in New Mexico, I asked where their parents were from. They were from Española, New Mexico. This did not make sense to me until I learned about New Mexico's colonial history. New Mexico's history as a former colony has led to some New Mexicans identifying as the direct descendants of Spanish colonizers. So they identify as Spanish. While in reality, all of those of Hispanic descent are mestizos, and therefore have Spanish, indigenous, and African heritage. Some choose to identify with Spanish heritage as a way to gain political power and to cut ties with indigeneity and Blackness that they were taught were racially inferior. As Lux and Vigil explain in their essay, Return to Aztlán, the wealthy families designated themselves with pride as castizos, of pure bloodlines, meaning no miscegenation, and often claiming genealogy dating back to the conquistadores. The colonial tradition of being pro-white, Spanish, or other European and anti-Indian was deeply ingrained. This sentiment was so well ingrained to New Mexican muscle memory that its presence still affects our modern-day social political climate. In many ways, it has pushed New Mexicans to radical extremes. On one end of the spectrum, New Mexico is the first state to elect a Native American representative, while on the other, we are one of the states with the lowest rates in education and the highest in income disparity, issues that directly impact BIPOC communities. What we now know as New Mexico has been traditional lands of indigenous populations. It has been colonized by the Spanish crown through the indigenous labor from modern-day Mexico. It has been Mexican territory. It has been US territory. Today, it is the US's 47th state. Migration, conquest, and treaties, the population of the modern-day US Southwest has become a mosaic of peoples and culture. In his essay, Aztlán, Cibola, and Frontier New Spain, Chavez writes, just as the demolition of the Aztec state had been accomplished by an alliance of Spaniards and the Indians, the creation of New Spain, racially and culturally, would be the accomplishment of these two groups and their descendants, the mestizos. This would be as true in the northern borderlands as in the center of the viceroyalty. Later, this fact would lead to much uncertainty in the Chicanos' image of themselves in both Mexico and the Southwest. For being descendants of both conquered Indians and conquering Spanish and Indians, Chicanos would vacillate between self-identity as foreigners and self-identity as natives. As suggested in this quote, Spaniards had to rely on indigenous populations when they arrived in the New World. The alliance that was created by Spaniards and indigenous people went beyond the battlefield. Their alliance led to the creation of an entirely new group of peoples, mestizos, the children of Spanish conquerors and conquered indigenous peoples. This mixed and oppositional identity is the main cause for identity confusion in Nuevo Mexicanos. Mestizaje was the same in New Mexico as it was in the rest of the so-called New World, but the social political structures impacted the way people chose to adapt certain identities out of self-preservation. In my community, Hispanic was synonymous with Mexican, and it was a term we only used to identify on legal documents such as the census. This could not be less true of New Mexico. The one tool that can often bridge the illusory racial divide we have created in New Mexico is its colonial history, a key focus of most ethnic studies courses. Ethnic studies help us see beyond the perceived differences we now call race to the root causes of issues such as racism. Chicano studies is particularly relevant to the issues we face in New Mexico. If we believe that knowledge is power, there is no greater power for a group of marginalized peoples than to be educated on their history. The aim of ethnic studies is to educate and empower historically marginalized groups of people. As written in El Plan de Santa Barbara, a plan to integrate Chicano studies in US colleges and universities that came out of the 1960s civil rights movement, the institutionalization of Chicano programs is the realization of Chicano power on campus. The key to this power is found in the application of the principles of self-determination and self-liberation. These principles are defined and practiced in the areas of control, autonomy, flexibility, and participation. True liberation for Chicano students will not come with token representation. Chicanos must be involved in all planning regarding Chicano studies. Chicanos must hold positions of power and have influence in decision-making at all academic levels. Later, they add, the demand for self-determination in higher education is not a question of puerile power discussions. In this area, as in others of community life, a matter of survival, progress, and dignity. The practice of self-determination serves best the interests of the Chicano community and the long-range interests of society as a whole. Chicanos desire liberation for all. The tool to achieve this is education. But as Freire suggests, liberation cannot be left in the hands of the oppressor. Revolutionary acts must come from the oppressed. In this case, the education and curriculum for Chicanos must be done by that community, or we will continue to suffer from narration sickness. In my own experience, and in the conversations I've shared with some of my peers about ethnic studies, these classes are the only places where we feel at ease. They are places where we can let our guard down and not feel like we are being scrutinized, our very worth as humans and as academics being weighed on the scale of academia. They are the only places on campus where my knowledge of my people's history and culture is valued, where I don't feel invalidated for learning through oral histories about Quetzalcoatl and Coatlicue instead of reading Shakespeare growing up. The space that Chicanx Studies courses offer me and my peers to express ourselves fully as the individuals we are is what led me to want to teach the class. It is in the Chicanx Studies courses that I have taken in the Honors College that I have watched how my peers come out of their shells. It is in Chicano Studies courses that we remove our masks, the ones we have worn in order to pacify the others, the Anglo, the male chauvinist, the white feminist, the Hispanic from Spain. When we remove our mask, we speak freely of our pain and sorrows, but also our joy. We speak of our love for our community and our culture. We speak of the ways in which the fields weigh on our parents' back, the way that academia weighs on ours, and how despite all this, our spirit remains unbreakable. Centering our narrative as Chicanx peoples in an academic setting validates our experiences and allows us to see a new world of possibilities. Villanueva, who teaches Chicano studies in California, uses what she calls Chicano indigenous pedagogical praxis. She has also experienced the growth I am describing in her own students. She writes, "From my students, I have come to witness this hope manifesting in various forms of inspired activism, productive resistance, and/or culturally relevant healing. I know students who have engaged with readings, class discussions, field trips, and community intellectuals in my classes have gone on to challenge the coloniality of power and incessant proliferation of racial hierarchy and gender inequality existing in the world. In this way, Chicano Studies serves to empower and inspire students of color to move beyond the classroom, to work at campus and in their communities at large for the benefit of their community. Colleges and universities serve as the breaking off point in order to work for liberation in our society at large. My lived experiences and the personal and academic growth I had while taking Chicano Studies courses was what inspired me to teach this course. Preparing to teach this course was another story. I have been a tutor since I was 11 years old. I have been a student my entire life. Neither of these prepared me for the undertaking that it is to prepare a course. I spent an entire summer reading about pedagogy, discussing pedagogy, and reflecting on what I want pedagogy to look like in my classroom. I spent a semester learning about lesson planning, course objectives, and assessments. I planned course activities and material. Through this process of developing the course with Dr. Gomez, we focused on the Aztec philosophy of Floricanto. Floricanto is the Aztec philosophy of being multiplicitous. Aztecs did not specialize in any one field. They were warriors and leaders, as well as artists and philosophers. Just like Chicanx peoples are academics, activists, artists, and more. Villanueva describes a similar experience in her own lesson planning. My studies have shaped my desire to teach across multiple disciplines and to even disrupt the notion of a discipline. They have further allowed me to perceive the classroom as a space of hopeful resistance where minds are cultivated, ideas are nurtured, identities emerge, and convictions coalesce. While parallels can be drawn between these two pedagogical approaches and honors' interdisciplinary approach, there is one key difference. Floricanto and Villanueva's pedagogy want to educate and empower future revolutionaries. We want our students to leave the classroom feeling like they can change their communities, like they can change the world. It is here where we draw from Freire's theories of liberation. Part of empowering future revolutionaries is to give them a solid grounding in where they come from, in their own value and the value of their experiences. This is where we draw from sentipensante pedagogy. We must also arm them for the revolution. This is where we draw from Linda Berry's pedagogical practice of incorporating workshop-style lessons. Thus, we created our Floricanto pedagogy. Half of our seminar time is dedicated to learning and discussing theory. The other half is dedicated to workshop, where we learn about using art as activism. Finally, I am teaching the course. While I am confident in my preparation, it does not ease my nerves. The ghost of self-doubt still lingers, making my armpits sweaty and my cheeks flushed. There are no educators in my family. My mother worked as a substitute teacher for most of my childhood, but even then, she would just follow a lesson plan. She asked me just the other day what I was teaching, and I have been telling her about the class for 2 years. Despite how unaware she is of my academic work, even when it's all I talk about, she offers me moral support. My peers cheer me on as well. Their support is appreciated, but it also becomes a burden. It reminds me that even when I feel like falling apart, I cannot fail. So I gather all my pieces and I put on a show. While I admire the unwavering self-confidence of people like Donald Trump, even if I don't understand it, my self-doubt is a blessing in disguise. My feelings of inadequacy may never go away, but neither will my desire to improve myself. In the words of Gloria Anzaldúa, humildes yet proud, quietos yet wild, nosotros los mexicanos, Chicanos, will walk by the crumbling ashes as we go about our business, stubborn, persevering, impenetrable as stone, yet possessing a malleability that renders us unbreakable. We, the mestizas and mestizos, will remain. In this journey we call life, wherever I end up, whether that be in academia or not, I know that I will get there through my continuing effort to be the best version of myself. And it helps me to think that this is not a burden I carry alone, and that somehow the wearing of my bones will lighten the load for those that come after me. This is the nature of the Chicanx. We bear unimaginable burdens for the sake of our community. In Chicano studies, we constantly extend our hand to lift each other up. We seek to make the icy road we walk one easier for everyone. And that's it. Thank you. I guess.
Thank you so much for that lovely presentation. Are you willing to entertain some questions from the audience either through the chat, or if you guys want to unmute, you can ask verbally as well?
Yeah. That's ready for questions. If there are any. Or comments, those are welcome as well.
Hi, Aida. I have a question. First of all, good job, great job. The presentation is titled including Chicanx studies into honors courses, right? So as you explained, you're working out your bones for the growth of these programs in universities and so many other institutions. Where or how do you visualize Chicanx studies courses in the next 15, 20 years? Just like in a perfect world, how do Chicanx studies incorporate themselves into interdisciplinary studies?
Right, thank you. Well, as was mentioned by Villanueva, or the citation is Toscano because her last name is Toscano Villanueva. I think we have to disrupt this notion of a discipline, right? Chicano studies and ethnic studies in general have been reduced to just the Chicano studies department, or just the African American students department, or just, this department. And I think that's very limiting, because then it's only people who are interested in taking those classes who either identify with that or are curious about that will take these classes, right? Versus in a space like honors, where students might be maybe obligated to take these classes sometimes, but I think that once you get the opportunity to take that class, you'll realize why they're important, and why, even if you don't identify as Chicano or African American or Asian American, you can still learn from them, and you can still have a very interesting experience in those classes. We see I've seen some classes in my psychology program where it's cross-cultural psychology, which they attempt to do what Chicano studies or ethnic studies does, but it's not the same. So I think I want to see them in different disciplines, not just within the Department of Chicano Studies. Any other questions?
I wonder if you, Margot.
This is not a question, but I have so many comments that I even took notes because your talk led to so many reflections and so many things to think about. I want to say congratulations. First of all, it was an excellent presentation. I love the way that you organized it, with beginning with story, with the personal story, and of course all the academic I wanted to say stuff. That's not really the nice word to say. All the academic background was there as well, but the way that you integrated the personal and the abstract was really, really masterful. I was aware that I identify exactly as you do. I share your identity as Mexican American. That's what I call myself. That's what I like to call myself. And yet what you were talking about made me realize how strong geographical differences can make how we live that identity. I grew up in New Mexico, and I always felt, well, most people around here look like me. People who look like me have always been part of the political system. So I felt it was different from somebody who grew up Chicano in Texas, or Chicano in California, or Chicano in Chicago. So you just made me aware of how strong those differences can be geographically. I also love the way you made recommendations, and Maria's question led to further recommendations. I also thought of what a wonderful teacher you are, or you must have been. Aida was in one of my classes, and she always was great in the presentations that she gave. But I think you have the quality of a teacher that is both confident, speaking confidently, but also having a lack of confidence so that you don't get too self-inflated. And also the idea of over preparation. I know us teachers, we always feel like we want to be way over prepared so that we're not under prepared. And bravo to you for having that recognition. And then the last comment has to do with the realization, or the how you reinforce the idea that so much of the canon, or what is out there, is with the assumption that the standard is what I might call white studies, instead of the other things that you talk about that are divided into departments. So thank you for reminding us of that as well. And thank you for all those other reminders. And didn't want to talk too long, but I had so much to say.
It's okay, thank you.
If there's still time, I was going to ask a couple of questions based on the concept of revolution. You mentioned revolution a few times, and I was wondering, first, how you define it in the context that you're speaking about in this presentation, and two, how would you want such a revolution to look?
That's a good question. I guess I would define that revolution in terms of something that's probably unattainable, right? Which would be self-liberation. And we talk about this a lot in different contexts, but it gets summed up into equality and equity, right? Like, that's beyond that is liberation, which is what we want, and it seems unattainable. but that's the goal of a revolution, right? Is to break from the status quo and the rules and all those structures that are keeping us at different levels in this hierarchy that we're talking about, or that I talked about. And I, in a perfect world, again, I would like that to be peaceful. I would like that to look like art and activism and this, what we're doing right now, right? My presentation or discussions or classrooms, right? Where we do this kind of work. That's where I would, in a perfect world, want it to be, and I would want it to see. Unfortunately, I think we don't live in a perfect world, and often that's reflected in violence. And it's sometimes it's necessary, sometimes it's unavoidable. In a perfect world, again, I wish it wasn't so. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Are there other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Can everybody hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess I want to begin first by saying, thank you for your presentation and for sharing your reflections about the field more broadly of Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx studies, and also your own journey of figuring out how to create a course in the field, right? What does it mean to create a course? How do you approach it? How do you engage with students? What is your relationship to community? I think these are all very important questions that ethnic studies fields, whether it's Native American studies, American Indian studies, Indigenous studies, Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx, or Mexican American studies, African American studies, and even Asian American studies, right? They're conceptualizing and at the epicenter, really bringing these questions and ideas and approaches to the forefront. I think, I guess to comment on what you said, it's really, I think you bring up very important points about the need and the desire and the want and the vision to be able to have Chicano, Chicana studies courses in every field, right? You're talking about, well, what does it mean to create courses in the sciences? What does it mean to create courses in the honors college? What does it mean to have courses in Spanish, in English, in geography, right? So, and I think that's the beauty of what was being articulated in 1969 with the Plan de Santa Barbara, right? Part of what they were saying is, hey, we need to develop a field. We need to develop ways of understanding our own communities that doesn't blame us or think of us as the problem. And we need to figure out how we can use these academic spaces to support our communities. So I think part of what you're really highlighting, right, is that at one point, Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx people were able to build these departments, but as a result of university control, right, there wasn't an opportunity to be able to extend these classes into various fields and into various departments. And I think what you're pushing for is, hey, well, what about that vision, right? That needs to happen simultaneously as we continue to build the field of Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx studies, which is constantly being questioned, which is constantly being interrogated, which is constantly being defunded alongside Native American studies, alongside African American studies, alongside Asian American studies, right? And I guess part of this vision is also, well, what would it mean to develop a college that is specific to ethnic studies, a college that is specific to third world studies, no? So I think part of what you're really pushing us to think about is, well, how can we practically begin to do that? And your class is an example of how we begin to do that. So with that, I want to say I'm really excited to learn about your class, and hopefully you can tell us a little bit more about what the class is going to be like, right? What kind of materials are you thinking of including? What were your reflections in terms of how you're going to engage with students, how you're going to bring in community? Kind of what were your thoughts on some of that, the construction of the course itself?
Yeah, so I'm in the middle of co-teaching the class right now with Dr. Gomez. And so Dr. Gomez has given me a lot of responsibility and has put a lot of faith in me by allowing me to teach the workshop entirely by myself. So, Dr. Gomez is obviously the specialist and the expert in Chicano studies and in theory. So she teaches the first half by discussing our readings and discussing theory and sharing theory with us. And then I try to implement the theory in the workshop. So we've done identity collages in order to discuss, you know, the different identities that Chicanos can take, right? Because there's no one way, there's no right way to be Chicano, as Dr. Gomez always likes to tell us. I have this thing where I show the art piece of the day, and so I'll share a piece that was created by someone who identifies as Chicano, and we discuss it, right? So I'll share the piece and I'll be like, what are some of your thoughts? What are some of the things that you could see? And then I'll talk a little bit about what I see and what I've been trained to see by studying these pieces. We've done a couple workshops on like close readings. We're going to be doing some debates later in the semester. It's a lot of fun and a lot of pressure as well. I don't know if that answers your question. Okay. Is there any other questions or comments or anything?
Yeah, actually, I have a question, Aida. I was wondering what you thought, if any, what type of role does public education, especially in perhaps high school, plays in kind of getting this, especially in New Mexico, because like you said, you know, I grew up here as well, and I know we've talked about this before, and the type of the ways that people identify and things like that, but also like you said, and like the other people have commented on bringing ethnic studies into, you know, into the sphere of, you know, other types of disciplines and all that, and also bringing it kind of to more of a forefront where people are actually thinking about them, because, you know, I study international studies, and so I get to kind of look at a lot of different things like that, but a lot of other people take a more, you know, straight route on learning, you know, just one field. And, you know, it is I think that that's a great idea, and I hadn't really thought of it that way, bringing it into other fields. But I like that. And so I was just wondering if you thought that, you know, public education, especially in New Mexico maybe, but anywhere, has a role to play in that.
Absolutely. And, you know, I don't even know how to answer your question. I guess I could say that, yes, I think public education has a big role. And I think that starts at the departmental level, at the institutional level, right? Who is in charge of curriculums? Who's in charge of the education system, right? Funny story that happened just today is that my mom works for APS, and she's a social worker, and she was assigned to the Sandia base to work at the school at the Sandia base. And she needs a special permit to get into the base. And she's been trying to get it for like 2 weeks, and she was not able to, and they would not give her a reason until she found out today that it's because somebody filled out that she was not a US citizen in the forms. That somebody was probably an APS employee. My mom has been a US citizen for 20 years, over 20 years, and this is still something that's happening, right? So I think that education is a big part of trying to deal with some of these issues that we have in our everyday lives. And again, Dr. Donovan wrote, who's in charge of the budget, in the chat, right? You're not going to have a good education system that addresses these issues, that deals with these issues, if the people who work for the education system are doing things like this. And it's not everyone, obviously. It's not, we can't generalize that it was everyone in there, that everyone is involved somehow, but these things are allowed to happen. I don't know. So I don't know how to answer your question very well, Miguel, but I think that my answer is yes. We need to start doing something about having Chicano studies and ethnic studies courses in elementaries and high schools and all of that.
I quickly also want to comment. Aida, you and I were both in Mariah's class last spring in Chicanx Civil Rights and movements. And I think that the work that we were doing back then, even in the middle of COVID, right, a lot of us were displaced in March, and we were working on community service projects that did reach out to the community through SWAP. Do you remember exactly what that stands for? The Southwest
Organizing Project.
Yeah. And so I think that that's a perfect example of what Miguel is saying, what Gustavo was asking about. Our class was actively trying to integrate what we were learning in the university setting to work with SWAP and to create different projects that further reached out to students in public schools, because they also have their own programs that work with educating young Chicanx students, Latinos, and getting them interested in policy work and community work, food justice, all of that. I'm not sure what Aida's project was. My project specifically did like a whole online timeline website based on 500 years of Chicano history, so that could be accessible to not just our class, not just SWAP, but the community as a whole.
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point, Maria, right? There's a divide between community and education that shouldn't be there. And I think programs like SWAP do a great job of bridging that. My project for the class was actually to take what we read about in 500 years of Chicano history and turn it into a comic book. So my group made a comic book about Chicano history through narrative, right? Through creating fictional characters and situations and kind of telling that story. Thank you again, Maria, for that comment. That's a great comment. Any other questions? I don't know how long we have.
I think if there are any other questions, I think we'll say thank you, first of all, for a lovely presentation and for answering all these fantastic questions. Thank you, it was lovely.
I just need to get out a comment. It's a presentation like this. It's not just a lovely presentation. I want to say that presentations like these are put together. They're what build the revolutionary example that Aida is talking about. And I think that the more people who are willing to listen to ways of integrating courses like these, not just to keep them separated into departments or one class, is how we're going to get to a more equitable educational space, like Gustavo was saying, like Aida is presenting here. So thank you. And great job, Aida. I hope you continue this work everywhere you go.
Thank you, everyone.